Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hauser and Wirth. I'm Russell Salmon, Director of Public Programs here at the Gallery. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. We're very lucky to have the distinguished British artist Sonia Boyce DBE RA with us today to present her lecture, The Intercultural Discussing New Work. This program celebrates the opening weekend of Sonia Boyce Improvise with What We Have, the gallery's first major solo exhibition with the artist, which is now on view at our 22nd Street space. If you haven't seen the exhibition yet, the gallery is open until 6 p.m. today. I definitely recommend you go over there. It is remarkable. Over the course of 4 decades, Sonia Boyce has developed a powerfully original practice that transcends boundaries as an interdisciplinary artist and academic working across film, photography, print, sound, and installation. Boyce creates immersive and experiential spaces that explore themes of play, disruption, and revelation in which the audience become active participants. Boyce's practice today is focused on questions of artistic authorship and cultural difference. She continues to break new ground through her commitment to questioning the production and reception of unexpected gestures, with an underlying interest in the intersection of personal and political subjectivities. In 2022, Boyce presented Feeling Her Way, commissioned for the British Pavilion at the 59th International Venice Biennale, for which she was awarded the Golden Lion for Best National Participation. Today's lecture, which Sonia created specifically on the occasion of her Hauser and Wirth show, will chart some of her ongoing interests in the debates around the decorative and visual art, dance and sound as social interaction, and the known and the speculative. It's also worth mentioning that there's a fantastic piece in the recent issue of Ursula magazine featuring Sonia and the magic of wallpaper. Copies of that issue and other Boyce publications are for sale in the bookshop. Thank you all again for being here. Now please join me in welcoming artist Sonia Boyce for the Intercultural Discussing New Work.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, yes. I'm very nervous. I need to begin by saying I've been here for a week with the install of the show and meeting up with lots of people, friends and new people as well. And I wanted to begin today by saying I've got a lot of thank yous. So please bear with me while I just say one that I'm really delighted to be showing alongside Maria Berrio and Susan Rothenberg. I think it's really strong, the 3 different shows. They're distinctive from each other, but collectively I think they send out. But also I would say with Emma's show as well that's on. It's just a really fantastic program, and I'm really feeling very privileged to be part of it. I need to say thank you to Neve, to Ruth, to Corinne, to Judith, to Mark, to Neil, to Uta, to Richard, to Andrea, Christine, Russell, Carolina, Michael, Greer, Marcus, Christina again? No? Christine and Christina, sorry. Victor, Mario, Poppy, Gemma, Philippe, Marissa, Megan, and the entire New York team. You've made this a really fantastic week for me. And just also the planning of the show has been seamless, actually. Then there's the Fabricators, Omni, who are based in London, and 22, who are based here in New York. It's been sublime working with them, actually. Michelle Tofy. I've been working with Michelle Tofy as a director of all of my films. We've been working together for 14 years, and so I really have to thank her enormously and the crew that she pulls together for my various projects, and particularly in this one, including my daughter Arani, who was doing one of the people who was doing the stills. And last but by no means least, to all the participants who've agreed to take part in what are really highly speculative projects. So, this exhibition, Improvise with What We Have, premieres 2 new works, Silent Disco and Carmen. Both new works centre multi-screen videos and expand into wallpaper, repeat patterns and prints. Both involve performances for camera with invited participants. Both take as their starting point popular culture, the disco and an esteemed British actress of the stage and screen. However, despite portraying these known popular forms, the discotheque and the television star, across both works something is withheld. The DJ playlists that provide the impulse to dance that we can't hear, in the case of Silent Disco, while Carmen Munroe watches film footage of herself out of view from the audience while the camera surveys her face. And something in both works is added or reworked in terms of the soundtrack as well as visual effects. In this talk, I want to speak about the new work, but within a wider historical context. Back in 2004, I was at a talk given by Adrian Piper in London, where she was discussing her art practice, in which she talked about funk lessons from 1982 to 1984 and other participatory projects. I was intrigued by how she took a very familiar art form, dance music, as the basis for speaking about cultural relations. Several years later, in 2016, I was invited to put together a day-long symposium around the work of Evan Ifikoya, who'd been making a series of works about dancing for camera, in particular Disco Breakdown from 2014, and I was struck by the legacy of funk lessons, as well as Gillian Waring's Dancing in Peckham from 1994, all seemingly concerned with the interface between private and public worlds. So I've been thinking about dance in the social realm for some time. Silent Disco was made earlier this year. It involves 2 DJs, Zazie Ifor and Aisha Mirza, and a guest list of participants who are invited to come and be filmed dancing at a bar in London under the arches of an old railway line. The decision to make it a silent disco with everyone wearing headsets where they could switch channels between the DJs was initially very pragmatic. The potential cost of several music copyright licenses for the tracks played at the disco was going to prove prohibitive. Plus, it was likely to cause difficulties in editing the process of the footage. Consequently, I was intrigued to know what the acoustics of people dancing and other forms of informal interaction might reveal, without the musical tracks covering their bodily sounds. To be honest, when I sat down to view the raw footage, the soundtrack was very weird and quite dystopian, despite the convivial nature of the evening. During the event, I don't think anyone was aware that what started as disparate sounds of feet shuffling on the ground gradually became, as the night progressed, a more uniform sound, not dissimilar to a marching band, as the crowd's foot stomping became in sync, almost militaristic. The look of the headsets with their blue and red lights, signalling which channel the listener was on, also has a science fiction aesthetic, a sensibility I decided to run with throughout the show. This science fiction aesthetic includes the soundtrack to the other video work, Carmen, which I'll come on to later. I'd never been to a silent disco before, so I was not fully prepared for the strange disjuncture between being inside the event with others when I placed the headset on and feeling quite voyeuristic and displaced when I took the headset off. There was something quite illicit about observing the intimacy and self-expression taking place. But of course, the dance floor is replete with looking and being looked at. Checking each other out sits under the surface of going out to have a good time. In the opening of his book, Together Sometimes, Music, Affect and Intimacy on the Dance Floor, writer Luis Manuel García-Mispireta introduces the idea of stranger intimacy when he says, and I quote, "The tricky thing about dance floors is that they are places where both inclusion and exclusion happen, whether subtle or conspicuous. Club cultures always find ways to signal who is welcome to join in the dance. Electronic dance music scenes tend to emphasize their inclusivity while downplaying their exclusions, and this tendency can be tracked back to their subcultural origins, from the clandestine queer of colour dance parties of early disco to the mass gatherings of suburban youth in the 1990s rave era. These scenes share a history of utopian longing for radically open inclusivity, especially for those who experience exclusion everywhere else in society. As a result, these music scenes avoid focused talk about who belongs and how, instead relying on vague references to shared musical tastes, open-mindedness and good vibes. This book sets out to explain this getting along in terms of stranger intimacy, that is, the gestures of social warmth, sharing and vulnerability between strangers that occur with surprising frequency and intensity." End quote. Maybe the being on view aspect of silent disco is why I had several conversations with concerned would-be participants who asked if I was anticipating a particular type of dancer, whether they would measure up, and whether they might be a bit too old. I didn't have a specific demographic in mind. I think having the added dimension of a film crew and photographers there to capture the night spooked some people. One even saying to me afterwards, "I hope you'll be kind in the edit." To capture, of course, is to have a certain control over representation and how one might be seen by others. So mine is a social practice that seeks to invite other people into the making of the work. I'm always interested in how others take up space and a sense of their own agency. In these performative situations, there is only one chance to capture, a verite style of immediacy, emphasizing realism and naturalism. Nothing gets repeated. There is no rehearsal or set pieces. It is all speculative. It's all about improvisation and seeing what can happen as the event unfolds. During the editing process, I could see that the crew captured the same things, but from different angles, as if they themselves were enacting a dance. Other times I could see that they were playing with the scenario as it was unfurling through the lens. While I encourage others to play or simply be themselves, unscripted, during these performance events, I reserve the right to play once I receive the documentation. That is, the video footage, sound recordings, and photographic stills. In the 1990s and into the 2000s, a discussion raged about the differences between performance and the performative, as well as performance art and its documents. Much of this conversation seemed to be about the status of the performance document in relation to the live event, suggesting a hierarchy, as if the document is a poor relation, a husk of the event, emptied of its potency, a dry relic. In recent years, I've been able to see the performance documented as an opportunity to create another type of visual and sometimes sonic experience. A light bulb moment occurred when I realized that I could take these documents on a journey, not simply as a stand-in for the performance, but as independent objects in the world. This image comes from a still captured during a performance event that took place at the ICA in London in 2016 that I later turned into a wallpaper design as part of its installation. The repeat patterns for silent disco, and that is silhouette, entering the disco, and geo candy stripe, are all derived from still photographs taken on the night of the dance. They emerge from the performance documents and signal my chance to play with the material that has been gathered. Here I must say something about repeat pattern and the decorative. It was fellow artist Yinka Shonibari who drew my attention to the relationship between ornamentation and its reading as overabundance and excess, particularly as it relates to early modernist practices. Yinka was invited to curate an exhibition titled Criminal Ornamentation, drawing from the Arts Council of England's public collection, where he selected the works for the show. His curatorial starting point was a sampling from a highly influential lecture given by the modernist architect Adolf Loos in 1910 that denounced ornamentation as a form of degeneracy, that Loos assigned to what he has classed as primitive people. This relation between plain and simple form and the excesses of the decorative I find really intriguing. In his introduction to the exhibition catalogue of criminal ornamentation, Yinka states, and I quote, "In choosing criminal ornamentation as my title, I have paraphrased the lecture Ornament and Crime by Adolf Loos, one of the most vociferous proponents of a stripped-back, functional modernist style. In the context of early 20th century Vienna, surrounded by the ubiquitous ornamentation associated with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this clean, functional vision would have been quite liberating. But his teachings fed into the idea of architects like Le Corbusier, and gradually Loos's thinking became cemented into a kind of tasteful modernist law. This elitism can be seen in Loos's essay, in which he refers to people who use ornamentation as being almost like primitives and talks of the vulgarity of the excessive use of colour." End quote. In the same exhibition catalogue, curator Michelle Khoo, in her essay Postcards from the Edge, raises similar issues when she says, and I quote from her too, "Decoration is invested with an atmospheric power to shape sensation, finding traction in both turn-of-the-century empathy theory and perceptual psychology. Yet some saw in this world a terrifying mirror of capitalism's rapacious penetration into every site, every milieu, even mental life itself. Nothing seems more emblematic of this horror vacui than Edward Villard's Interior, Mother and Sister of the Artist from 1893, which depicts the patterned wallpaper almost animate, live as if a vortex nearly swallowing the sister whole. Nature run wild, the savage. These pernicious mythologies were part and parcel of the colonial age, and ornament became synonymous with the atavistic and depraved. The most famous articulation of this phobia was that of the architect Adolf Loos, who condemned the ornaments of the Jugendstil as degenerate in his notorious Ornament and Crime lecture. The transgressions of ornament were even comparable to prostitution and miscegenation. The woman and the Papuan, guilty of embellishment, become the objects of his hysterical Orientalist bigotry. Loos's polemic thus exposed some of the most vitriolic tensions within the idea of the ornament, a contest between meaningless decoration and meaningful abstraction, interior and exterior, impure feminine and pure masculine, primitive and modern, the fear that significant form could somehow disintegrate into mere wallpaper, function into futility, end quote. This shaping of sensation that Khoo talks about is something that I'm actively seeking. Repeat pattern is something that I've worked with for decades, since I was an art student in the early 1980s. Originally, I used pattern to denote the multi-sensory nature of my domestic life growing up in a Caribbean household in the UK during the design impulses of the 1960s and 70s. I continue to employ the multi-sensory to create installation environments, often using a Rorschach method of mirroring an image to create the pattern. This idea that ornament, decoration, pattern can overwhelm, even emasculate, is interesting, suggesting that below the surface of the surface print, there are other narratives at play, underscoring what Khoo raises are pattern's psychological effect. This effect seems to be an invitation into the realm of fable and otherworldliness, like the effeminate, which clusters ideas of the feminine and non-conforming masculinity or the folkloric. And here I must thank Andy Warhol for his introduction of wallpaper into the White Cube Gallery, as well as Robert Gober, and here is Untitled from 1990 and Forest from 1991. Both artists speak of the body's relation to nature and the untamed. The stills photographer for the silent disco shoot, like the rest of the film crew, were encouraged to capture what caught their eye without direction from me. Although as a starting point, I mentioned to the team my interest in the science fiction aesthetics of the film Blade Runner from 1982, which was set in the year 2019, imagining a world of synthetic humans, flying cars, and mercenary wars on space colonies. Here the question of the alien to be read as the foreigner and alienation coincide. I was also interested in the moody atmosphere of Roy DeCarava's photograph, Dancers, New York, from 1956. DeCarava was interested in pushing the technology of photography. He sought the possibilities of DMAX, which refers to the maximum density of print to explore the darkest colour black achievable with more detail in the shadow areas of an image. We think of the discotheque and disco music as intimately connected to black cultural practices. In parallel with the discussions about decoration and ornament as a degraded art form projected onto female and racialized bodies, at the beginning of the 20th century, a similar discourse was raging about the influence of American jazz music in Europe and the social integration it was fostering, which the establishment perceived as a threat. In his essay, The Impact of Jazz on European Culture, Bernd Ostendorf suggests, and I quote, "The introduction of jazz music into Europe in the early part of the 20th century involved a radical break with the rules of performance and the habits of reception in Western musical culture. This break had occurred first in America between the years 1896 and 1910, when the African-American idiom entered the musical mainstream under the generic label of ragtime. The introduction of African elements into the Euro-American canon was not just another case of selective borrowing and exchanging. It had more to do with a paradigm shift, a confrontation of dissimilar, even antithetical musical cultures that would have repercussions beyond the US on an international scale. Although initially labelled a child of the gutter or a cultural mongrel, jazz satisfied the avant-garde desires of modernism more than any of the classical arts. The new music spoke to the agendas of futurism, surrealism, Dada, primitivism, radical democracy, multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, and ushered in a new way of being all at once. It gave to these high cultural expressions a structure of feeling. Many jazz fans shared the uncanny feeling that they had not only discovered a new musical genre, but a new way of being in the world. The promise of musical and bodily freedom that this music imparted to its fans helps to explain why many white Americans or Europeans describe their first encounter with jazz in terms of a religious conversion using a rhetoric of liberation. But its detractors were just as adamant. The violent hostility against jazz in the early part of this century was motivated by the pervasive feeling of decline common among the conservative ruling classes. From their perspective, ragtime could be read as the tip of the iceberg, as a pathological, immoral, patently sexual and subversive substratum of cultural rot. No wonder, then, that the American composer Daniel Gregory Mason, who lived between 1873 and 1953, greeted ragtime with the appropriate disgust. Let us purge America and the divine art of music from this polluting nonsense. Swiss-born Hans Muck, the director of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, concurred. I think that what you call ragtime is poison. A person inoculated with the ragtime fever is like one addicted to strong drink, end quote. The dying embers of these historical tropes of excess, of there being a sense that society is becoming out of control or overwhelmed due to intercultural exchange, still plays out in contemporary art's exploration of dance music culture. This can be seen in the found footage video of Mark Leckie's Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore from 1999, where revelers appear in an altered, almost trance-like state. Or Jeremy Deller's 2018 classroom lesson and documentary film Everybody in the Place, An Incomplete History of Britain, 1984 to 1992, which situates rave and acid house culture at the centre of the seismic social and political changes that continue to dominate the public discussion about Britain and Britishness. Both works hark back not only to the earlier modernist tropes that I've outlined, but also the boundary-pushing artwork, Funk Lessons, where Adrian Piper uses the didactic structure of a lesson, which perhaps this mode also influenced Jeremy Deller, to teach the basic moves of funk dance to mostly white college-educated groups of participants. The question of time and the aesthetics of an earlier science fiction sensibility, as I mentioned, also runs throughout the work of Carmen, 2025. I first met Carmen Munroe, actress of stage and screen, in 2022, when King Charles and the royal household were developing a portrait project to commemorate pioneers of the Windrush generation. The Windrush generation, for those who don't know, were those arriving from the colonies of the Anglophone Caribbean to help rebuild Britain just after the Second World War. But here I'm going to place the Crown's initiative in a much wider social context. In 2018, a political storm broke out, the Windrush scandal, which refers to UK Home Office's failure to grant legal rights and status to many Commonwealth citizens who migrated to the UK between 1948 and 1973, which led to their wrongful detention, deportation, denial of public services, and removal from employment. This caused enormous hardship for those involved and sent shockwaves across the nation. Secretly leaked Home Office files revealed that the government deliberately named it as a hostile environment policy to covertly pursue a programme of repatriation. The Royal Windrush Portrait Project, subversively some might say, emerged as a way to celebrate the contributions that this generation have made to British life. Carmen Munroe arrived in the UK from Berbice, Guyana in 1951, initially to study ophthalmic optics, the science of visual perception, but instead turned her interests to the theatre, and she quickly became a much sought-after actress. When I was approached by the royal household for the project, my response was that I didn't do portraits, assuming they were looking for a conventional easel painter. They persisted, and I gave in, slightly worried by what it would mean to refuse the king. And I was sent a list of the 10 sitters who had agreed to have their portraits made. Carmen was on the list, and I got very excited as I could see potential parallels with a previous multifaceted project, the devotional series that's been ongoing since 1999. So the devotional series consists of an archival gathering, one might say, of women of colour in the British music industry, many of whom remain unsung, shining bright for the briefest of moments and then disappearing from public view. The names and some of the memorabilia that I've been collecting of these musicians have largely been shared with me by the public. It constitutes a collective knowledge bank of hundreds of creative talents that have contributed to the sound of Britain, dating back to the 19th century and through to the present. Across her illustrious career that has spanned over 60 years, Carmen has performed in several iconic theatre and television productions, for example, appearing in an early episode of the long-standing science fiction television series Doctor Who in 1967, as well as the black family sitcom Desmond's, which was syndicated internationally. She's also one of the co-founders of Britain's longest-running black theatre company, Talawar Theatre. Now in her 90s, I knew I would only get one chance at capturing her image, and so alongside the production of a print of Carmen for the Royal Portfolio, I also arranged for a film crew to film her in a local cinema. I put together a short showreel of moments from her career and had her sit and watch excerpts from her performances while the cameras rolled. I simply wanted to look at her face. The structure of the two-channel film is built around the moments when Carmen takes long blinks as she watches the showreel that we are unable to see. What she sees is therefore inaccessible to the gallery goer. As she blinks on the left-hand side screen, there is a timeline of moments from her career, and on the right-hand screen, glitter rises from her closed eyes. I want to meditate for a moment on an essay by Roland Barthes. It's an essay in the book Mythologies from 1957, titled The Face of Garbo, where Barthes talks about the on-screen presence of Greta Garbo as a figure of ideal beauty, as an object of contemplation. In the essay, Barthes suggests that the performer on screen, and for my purposes this can also is not just the cinematic screen but also the televisual, that it allows us to look upon their face in a way that lovers may look at each other, or how parents might gaze upon their child, looking without the worry of an awkward returned gaze. Yet figures like Carmen who appear on our screens are both accessible and inaccessible. They carry an aura of mystique. A peculiar kind of stranger intimacy arises. For a generation growing up in 1970s and 80s Britain, Carmen Munroe came to represent our mum on a national television, on a national scale. A familiarity without us knowing her personally. Some people in the process of editing this video portrait have said to me, she looks so familiar, but they couldn't immediately place her. And here's the rub. Even though she's been present in our lives, it has been hard to piece together a timeline of her achievements. Yet still, in 2025, this year, she received a damehood from the King's New Year Honours List for services to drama. Yet at the same time, Carmen doesn't have a dedicated presence in the National Theatre Archives. This discrepancy of simultaneous presence and obscurity interests me, and I have to, and you know, in the making of the work, I had to kind of resist a kind of overwhelming sense of melancholia about the schism between known and not known, and contribution and non-contribution. The soundtrack of the two-screen video portrait, Carmen, of seemingly abstract electronic noise, takes its lead from another overlooked figure, Delia Derbyshire. Delia composed the original theme tune to the Doctor Who television series and was a pioneer of electronic music. Her experimental sound practice was a precursor by at least a decade to the German band Kraftwerk, who formed in 1970, and are considered to have spearheaded what was to become synth pop that fed into rave and electronic dance music. On entering my exhibition, gallery goers will be aware of the cacophony of sound which they might also register as noise. This distinction between sound, and in particular the voice and background noise, is something that has been woven into my practice for some time and was a key component of my Venice Biennale show, Feeling Her Way, that Russell mentioned in the introduction. In 2015, I was lucky enough to be in a group exhibition here in New York, curated by the Whitney Independent Study Program titled Signal to Noise, or SN for short. The exhibition narrative sought to, and I quote, explore diverse practices including video, performance, conceptual writing and music to examine the material complexities of sound as the force that both allows and frustrates communication. Approaching sound as we experience it in the world, Signal to Noise considers sound as a crucial component of a broad landscape. reverberating through the social and material world, sound is a physical force that can make communication possible, even as it rattles against meaning. As a vehicle for speech, sound carries the voice of the law. And here, I would add that sound is a witness, and one of those things that I really often hold on to is this idea about the question of the archive. And a very familiar refrain within Black Church is, "Can I get a witness?" To which many people will reply, because we're talking about unofficial experience, or how experiences may not have been cemented within the mainstream. But also this idea that the voice of the law serves as a means of subversive language, end quote. These layers of seemingly disparate elements that constitutes Improvise with what we have speaks of the individual and the collective body in pieces. Always seeking to reconstitute itself, always trying to reconnect the disparate parts into a whole. I would like to finish by briefly talking about the audience and multi-screen time-based works. Any artist who works with video must reconcile that gallery goers may walk in and out of the screened work at any point, that they may or may not stay for the duration, unlike the cinema that has a time schedule where the audience is expected to sit and engage with the film from beginning to end. Time-based media for the gallery context places different demands on the viewer. Add to that the collage effect of multi-screen works, and the idea of having a singular, unified perspective is under duress. The split or multi-screen is just that, signalling that as a subject in the space of the work of the gallery goer is also split, divided, ununified, with several calls on their attention. In this sense, the audience is put in a position where they must assemble for themselves a sense of cohesion or not. However, they may choose to leave with a sense of the fragmentary. Thank you. So I think we're going to open it up and have a conversation, if people are up for that. Oh, there are microphones, so if anybody wants to start, please just put your hand up.
Any questions?
Hi. I was wondering, I guess, it's a question about the process or the kind of like curation that you did to match the works that you have up with the wallpapers, and at one point did you decide which stills were going to become the wallpapers, the patterns that were, recreated?
So there were two stills photographers, and so there was about 600 images that I filtered through for several months, which is why it sometimes takes me quite a long time to make the work. And I was really interested in so certain images, and I'm going to just quickly go back to... So this particular image, once I thought, I wonder what this one will do if I start this mirroring process of putting it together. And always what happens is something different emerges from the original image. And then it's a case of then scaling it and thinking, of course, in terms of putting the show together, I'd visited the gallery a couple of times. I've been there. I've been to the gallery before, but when I started to think about the show, I visited the gallery, and I was thinking about its scale and how I was going to manage the scale of the space, and what works I thought might sit where. And so I could say that I tend to use wallpaper as a way of holding a space. So I use it in a kind of structural ways, but I was really concerned not to have there to be wallpaper on every surface, because I think when you're going into that kind of environment, there needs to be moments when the eye can rest. And so it was a case of, I was literally, I suppose, thinking about the choreography of gallery goers and how I might try and persuade them to move around the space sorry, flipping through this. With this standing, now there are two very big white walls behind, and how to make the wallpaper and that as a structure leap forward as a kind of sculptural thing and as a kind of monument, you might say, so that you forget about the rest of the walls. They're really big walls. I'm going to go back very quickly. Sorry. Close your eyes. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, so this wall is 30 meters long. And I knew that I didn't want to have a very overwhelming pattern on it, but I didn't want a blank wall for the prints to sit on, the photographs to sit on. So I took a tiny element out of one of the photographs of the space where there are these kind of shapes that are kind of these sound bars that were in the bar that we were in, as the beginnings for actually drawing a mural that would occupy that wall, so that there's lots of things happening. I mean, part of what I was interested in actually was this idea of where does the artwork begin and end? So, the wallpaper, and then having something on top of the wallpaper, and then something on top of that, and that kind of multi-layering of things without it feeling too heavy, or I hope, too self-conscious. So I'm trying to deal with this, I'm trying to manage the space and thinking about people moving and what will catch their eye and what will draw them into the room. But I'm also thinking, okay, if I have really intense wallpaper throughout, then how overwhelming is that, and what's it doing to the eyes? I was really... Sorry, I'm going to move this slightly. So with this room, this wallpaper was... This room is really, truly a collage, whereas the other room is all of the elements come from that, what's documented from that performance. This is me gathering different bits and pieces. The wallpaper, mid-century optimism, I was thinking about the 60s, and this is when Carmen was starting to appear on television screens, and that idea of the 60s, notwithstanding, of course, the civil rights movement that was also happening, that there was this sense that the 60s was this moment of optimism. It was part of that kind of mid-century sensibility that something different could happen. So I was really wanting to create a space that was upbeat somehow. And I'd appropriated a piece from a kind of 1960s women's fashion magazine, where these women were wearing kind of very 60s geometric and groovy dresses, and I cut that out and then started to work with that and started to play. I mean, once I get a document, I just start to play with it and see what I can do with it, and then I create these repeat patterns. And of course, with the small prints that make one piece, for quite a long time, I've been my very first wallpaper was 2 sets of hands that were clapping. It was called clapping wallpaper, and so I've used hands and the idea of clapping and applause and kind of somehow addressing the audience as well as what it is within itself. Sorry, I rambled.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, that was great. I think also just, I guess, a final comment on, after hearing that, I heard a bit of a connection between what you were saying about how the wallpaper was occupying space and how the viewer had to have a moment of rest. Specifically, you were saying that while I was looking at this, the installation view of the silent disco piece, And I remember in the talk you had spoken about like taking your headphones off and what it was like to occupy a space. And I was thinking about this connection that you had in the silent disco moment of taking the headphones off and coming back in and out of it. And then what me as a viewer or any viewer would have coming and seeing all of that work and being kind of like all inside of it, and then having the rest of the big white walls.
Just as a kind of recalibrate. I mean, I didn't really talk about the fact of using, that I try not to do video projections in a kind of darkened space. And for two reasons. One, whenever I'm going into that kind of installation, I always have a moment of anxiety. Like, am I going to fall over and I'm going to trip over someone? My eyes have to readjust. And then I sit down and I think, oh God, how long do I have to sit here for? Which I think we all do. Do we not all do that? And so there's all these levels of anxiety for me about going into that kind of space. So and also because with video projection, you need a light lock space. So you're controlling the light like really tightly in order to see the image, particularly the image at its optimum. Now, LCD screens, television screens, are built to be able to see in daylight and in the dark, and that it can deal with the variations of light, natural light or not. And one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of this show, but also other works, is that I want people to feel that they can walk in and out for as long as they like, that they can move in this, that they're dancing unconsciously in the space, and that they don't have to. They're not tied into a schedule that in the way that we might behave when we go into the cinema. That actually it's about them making choices, and so they can see everything. And they can move around and they can stay if they want, or they can go if they want. You know, that I'm trying to make it seamless for the audience to kind of move through the space.
Thank you again.
This is probably a quick one, but related to this idea of moving in and out, I'm curious a little bit more about just the logistics of the participants in the silent disco and the extent to which they also had opportunities to move in and out, and if that was sort of recorded and captured in the final thing. And yeah.
So with all the projects that I've done in the last 20 years, say, what tends to happen is that I've got a particular space. Usually there's a performer. So in this instance, there were the two DJs, and their job was to get people to dance through their playlists, and then sent out notifications to a kind of network of people. So whoever was going to turn up was going to turn up, but we sent out over 100, and there were about 60 people that came. Everybody had to sign a release form, because everybody had to know that they were going to be filmed. There was some behind-the-scenes footage. So one of the crew was there to just capture what was happening. We had a bar. There was, at a certain point, because the crew would need to change batteries, download footage, so there was a break, and we all had pizza brought in, so everybody could eat. I mean, and everybody was given vouchers so they could have whatever drink they wanted to drink. But everybody had to sign a release form. The crew had to sign a release form. The performers have to sign, honestly, there's a lot of legal stuff that sits behind these projects. But the main thing that I want to happen once things begin is that no one's told what to do. So, although we'd rented these the headsets, if people wanted to leave and come back or just leave, they just had to register that they were going out, and it was put aside for them, and then they could go. And people did. They went out and had cigarettes, or they went and had chats. People moved in and out of the disco, as people do. There was no attempt to marshal people into a particular way, you know. So at first there were just a few people. Most people were kind of talking in the bar area, and just a few people joined the disco, and then more and more people kind of came in, and it got fuller. And as I said, towards the end of the evening, we were there for about 3 hours. Towards the end of the evening, and I literally, when I first heard the footage, I was like, God, this is really. Are they all dancing? They were listening to different things. Are they all dancing like you could hear their feet, like all of them doing that? And just thinking, how did that happen? And of course, I don't think they were aware that, you know, none of us while we were there were aware that that was what was happening. And so I found that really interesting.
Thank you for this talk. It was amazing. It seems like you put a lot of research into your work. So can you talk about your daily practice, you know, the role of research and other artists who have influenced you over the years?
Yeah, research is very, very key to what I do. Literally ever since I've been teaching now for 42 years in art schools, and as I've progressed on, you know, I've kind of taught courses and headed up departments and increasingly led either, I've had PhD students, but I've also led research projects. My most recent research project, which was between 2015 and 2018, was a project called Black Artists and Modernism. So the question about my art practice and my relationship to one, teaching, but also research, they're all interwoven. You know, they kind of bleed into each other. And for me, I think a lot of that has come from the fact that I've taught in the art school, and I've been very involved in all of the discourses that emerge, where you've got to then go to the studio and think about how does this apply? Or sometimes when doing tutorial, I found myself talking to a student about a particular thing, and then in the back of my head, I'm like, you're talking to yourself, really, because this is what you need to remember when you go back to the studio. So my relationship to studio, I mean, it's always been a kind of, I've never just had a studio practice. I'm trying to get there, even though I'm getting on a bit, but I'm trying to get there to the point where I spend all of my time. I'm trying to retire from academia, but in the art college context, one's always talking about references. Of course, one's always going to see shows. One's always trying to figure out the context for the work. And even though, and for a really long time, I realised that the way that I work, there is an impulse that pushes me to do something that I haven't rationalised. And this is I suppose this is an important point. When I was a student, I was taught a lot by conceptual artists from the 70s who were still, I started art school in the late 70s. And there was always this idea that you have an idea and then you follow it through, and that you're kind of rigorous with that, and it's almost a kind of discipline of practice. And then I'd always get chastised by my tutors, and they'd say, "Oh God, you're so post-intentional. Like, you don't know what you're doing, do you really?" And it's because I kind of act on the impulse of what I think might be what the work might be. Some might call it intuitively, but then started to embrace this idea and actually building this idea of having a kind of post-intentional practice where I set up a scenario and I'm not controlling what happens, and I'm not directing the crew, and I'm not directing any of the participants or the contributors to the work, and I'm just seeing what happens, and then afterwards I'm trying to then make sense. Oh, what was that? What was going on there? And I've built that, what was, I suppose, a criticism, I've built that as a kind of central understanding, you might say, of how I go about things. And that actually, if it doesn't make sense right now, it will at some point, because that's part of the research, you could say, is that I'm trying to make sense and then understand a context for the way that the work is emerging.
Sonia, could you talk a little bit more about these kinds of these kinds of terminologies are often put around the kind of practice, so socially engaged practice or performance. None of the words quite fit what you do. You work a lot with your recording. You're making videos, but you're not making video for the sake of video. So can you talk a bit about how your practice kind of hovers between and creates a new language within these kind of post-60s, post-intentional practices?
So on the question of a kind of social practice, which I've been doing since I'm going to go back. I'm really going to go back, way, way back. To the late 70s, early 80s, where I was very involved with like feminist art discourses, some very, very tough discussions about what constitutes feminist art practice and what doesn't, and questions about representing the body and so on and so forth. So in my early works, you could say my first anchor was seeing the work of Frida Kahlo and the ways in which she was performing in those works for us. She was very aware of the audience, and I kind of, you could almost say I entered art history through the work of Frida Kahlo and the question of presenting and representing oneself. Just a few years later, I'd stopped doing that. But actually, what Frida Kahlo's work allowed me to do was address some of the questions that were coming out of a feminist art practice. So there was a kind of Mary Kelly camp, which was about not representing the female form. And then there was this other camp where there was an insistence to represent the female form. But I always felt really guilty, so I used myself in those early works because I was too, not just shy, but also just felt the burden of the criticism about working with other people, questions about appropriation, questions about, what are you doing with somebody else's image somehow? And then I couldn't do any more images just of myself, and I started really gingerly trying to ask other people, would you mind being part of the work? And this led me into some of the discourses about a social practice. Now, and I'm not quite sure how social or socially engaged practice is understood here in the US, but in the UK there was a lot of discussion about, what I understood from that discourse is a kind of overhang from a 19th century sense of philanthropy, that one was dealing with the great unwashed through working in a socially engaged way, that one was making social commentary in a particular fashion that was saying, I'm here to represent that group, but that group can't speak for themselves. So my impulse to get other people to just be themselves in the work is coming from, they can represent themselves. If they've agreed to be part of this, they're coming with their own agency, they're coming to take part. That I'm not here as a school teacher in this field. I'm here to be swept up within it, and not to kind of... And I completely acknowledge that at the end of the process, I do take the imagery and I do work, but I try to make that really explicit with all the people that I'm working with, that whatever happens here... And I'm also very conscious to not denigrate the people that I'm working with. I try really hard to make sure that that's a kind of ethical stance, maybe, to be kind to the people that have agreed to take part in what I'm doing. But at the same time, they've agreed to take part, and whatever unfolds while they're there is the material that I'm going to work with. I don't know if I'm quite answering your question. Good to see you, by the way, okay?
I think I have a kind of convoluted question for you. So your work is incredibly subtle in the way that you bring so many complicated ideas into focus without being didactic or and I think that's very powerful, especially when you're referring to the way you located the history of dance through other artists, and also the importance of finding a voice, or in the case of silent disco, actually playing with that, who can hear what and who can say what. And obviously that speaks to the politics of representation. And you talked very eloquently then around feminist practice and collaborative practice, and it feels like we're in a moment right now where people's civil liberties and speech are being challenged, where you referenced Windrush and the fact that, a real backward step and a horrible kind of immigration policy that, an immigration policy that was turned into a repatriation policy and took away people's histories and rights. And we're seeing that across the globe right now. So it's a kind of big question, and I'm going to ask it anyway. Like, how does it feel for you showing this work here at the moment and touching ground softly with such a kind of poetic and beautiful work, but knowing that you're actually bringing some of those issues into focus around class, race, immigration, politics, representation? Do you mind me asking?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Sorry.
It's all right. It's all right. I think part of being asked to do this talk was just kind of set out my stall, mainly. So this is my first solo exhibition in New York, first exhibition with the gallery. And so I haven't had that many conversations prior to this moment about how what I'm doing, how it speaks to here, particularly in the context of now. So I've not really been, I'm kind of like literally feeling my way as to knowing how this may or may not land within. Also the question of, it's a very art city, so not knowing literally how this work lands and whether people are going to be able to find a label somehow to say what the work is. I did have a conversation in London about, Carmen Munroe and how are people going to even, recognise who Carmen Munroe is here in the US, and what it made me think about, and this may seem wrong, that we are very familiar in the UK with African American performers, artists, and so I can't see why we can't have a dialogue about Carmen Munroe, who has been very central in terms of really changing the cultural landscape. That that this should be a two-way conversation, but of course, I deliberately wanted it to be a poetic piece, because as I said, I just wanted to sit and watch her face. She's 90 in that video. She's going to be 93 this year, and I just kind of thought one doesn't get to see in that way more mature women represented in that way on television or on, and I just wanted to sit and watch her face. And so the edit came out of that, and thinking about structurally, she makes these long blinks. Oh, there's a really interesting connection between the fact that that I'm wanting this glitter to come from her eyes, and she came to the UK to study ophthalmics. And she came to understand about visual perception. I just kind of thought that was a really nice. But it's like, and I'm not expecting the audience to know that, but that for me was like, okay, this is me inside, structurally thinking about the work and where and how I might want to play. I'm not the definitive explainer of the work, I have to say, because I think that I don't know how people will receive what this is, and people will hopefully at some point tell me what they understand of it. But I know what my impulses are.